I knew that alcohol liberates people and makes them more sociable, but I did not even suspect that one of these conversations would help me uncover my wife's infidelity. Betrayal is always painful, and one question arises: why did a person decide to do this? My wife turned out to be the meanest person. I must have driven the Hooch Road a dozen times without ever noticing it on my right. It was a small white farmhouse just on the Tennessee side of the old route through the Great Smoky Mountains National Park. The road had several sections, including the old Cataloochee Turnpike, but in my grandfather's younger years it was simply known as Hooch Road, a winding dirt track through the Carolina mountains that helped lay the foundation for today's NASCAR culture of moonshine runners. The house was tidy, freshly whitewashed, and perfectly straight, with split rail fencing enclosing the pasture beside it. With a patched radiator hose and steam seeping from under my truck's hood, I knew I didn't have much time left on this stretch of road, so I pulled into the gravel drive and parked halfway to the house. "Hello, anybody home?" I called out after knocking on the wooden screen door. Mountain folks can be a bit wary of strangers, but once they get to know you, they are some of the best people around. Still, I kept my distance on the porch just in case. After a few moments, a face appeared behind an upstairs screen window. "Yeah? Who are you and what do you need?" a woman's voice responded. "Yes, ma'am, my name is Joshua Sutton from Waynesville, and I was hoping I could work on my truck and get some water from you. My radiator hose burst a few miles back, and though I patched it up quickly, it won't last much longer." "Wait right there," she told me before disappearing from the window. I glanced around and noticed how clean and tidy everything was. The screens were all in good condition, the porch was freshly painted, and a well-kept garden was flourishing off to the side. When I turned back to the screen door, I saw two large German shepherds standing guard in the doorway, silent and obedient to their master. "As long as you behave, the dogs will leave you alone," the woman said as she opened the screen door for me. "Come on in. Do you need anything to drink?" "Yes, please. A glass of water would be great, ma'am." "Are you related to the Sandy Hollow Suttons?" "There's a whole bunch of them over in Zacky Hollow." She looked me over as she asked. "No, ma'am, at least not that I know of. My dad's family has been in Waynesville for several generations, and no one ever mentioned any relatives in Sandy Hollow, but I guess you never know." She brought me a glass of water and motioned for me to take a seat as the dogs sat on their haunches, watching my every move. The cool iced water quenched my dusty thirst, while the breeze from the overhead fan dried my sweat-soaked shirt. "My name's Sandra Dresser, and the couple over there are Samson and Delilah." The two dogs sat still, their tongues hanging out. "I'm pleased to meet you, Mrs. Sandra. I was hoping you might have some supplies I could use to make a short flex pipe, preferably rubber. I noticed the old car collection by your pasture." "Oh, sure. Take whatever you need from any of them, if it helps you." "Thank you, Sandra," I replied, standing up slowly to avoid startling the dogs. Despite my efforts, both dogs stood until Sandra commanded them to sit. They obediently returned to their haunches. Sandra led the way out, with me and the dogs following. I couldn't help but admire her as she stepped off the porch. She looked to be around 30, with long dark hair in a ponytail through a ball cap, work boots, fitted jeans, and an old Deadhead t-shirt, complemented by bright blue eyes. After grabbing some tools from my truck, we walked down through the pasture to the collection of old cars parked behind a weathered barn. With some exploring, I was able to find flexible steel and rubber hosing, along with clamps that would provide a temporary fix. An hour later, my truck was operational. "It's getting close to supper time. Why don't you come in, get washed up, and have a bite before you head out?" she asked with inviting sincerity. I was hesitant at first, but I was also hungry, so I agreed. Besides, the delightful aromas coming from the kitchen would have held me captive regardless of any reluctance. I wasn't disappointed. Sandra had prepared a meal of smoked pork chops, mashed potatoes, collard greens, and black-eyed peas, accompanied by hot, moist cornbread, followed by bread pudding and hot coffee. "Ms. Sandra, That was the best meal I've eaten in years. I mean it. It was nothing. She tried to downplay her efforts to no avail. I don't get much company out here, and I love to cook, so I guess you came by at the right time. She tossed a couple of scraps to the two dogs that had kept a watchful eye on me the whole time I was in the house. In a gulp, the scraps were gone, and they continued their vigil with long tongues hanging out of their mouths. About those old vehicles by your barn. You know there are some people who might be interested in buying a couple if you're willing to sell them, I mentioned. She looked at me for a moment before averting her gaze. They belong to my husband. Well, my ex-husband. They've been sitting there since the day he left. I know that 65 Fairlane is worth a lot of money if you ever decide to sell it. And the same goes for that 57 Ford pickup, I informed her. He's been gone for 2 years now, and I suppose I should do something about it. A guy from Knoxville came by about a year ago, offering almost nothing for them. He thought I was a fool, so I sent him away. She smiled at the memory, lighting up the room. I helped her clean up after supper, and when we finished, I knew I had to leave, if I wanted to reach my destination before nightfall. Even though I'd only met her a few hours earlier, there was a comfortable politeness about her that I found attractive. I felt a bit disappointed to leave. Miss Sandra, I know someone who'd be very interested in that 57 Ford. If you consider selling it, I'd be happy to let him know. Here's my card. If you decide to sell, give me a call. I'd be glad to come out here again. I'd really like that. I think she understood I was hinting at a return visit, but I'd leave that decision to her. I needed to get back on the road. We shook hands graciously, and I started up my truck, turning back onto Hooch Road. I was driving up Route 321 towards Pittman Center, and I couldn't stop thinking about the attractive woman in the white farmhouse. She mentioned that her ex left 2 years ago, which was around the same time I became single. It feels like every day I'm reminded of how supposedly tough my life is now and how great it used to be. And of course, it's always the wrong people reminding me. I married my ex-wife 5 years before she left. Unlike Sandra's former husband, June Sutton keeps coming back, even though our divorce was finalized a year and a half ago. I used to think those were 5 good years, and June still says they were, but a lot of dark water has flowed under the bridge since then. When I first met her, June was a 19-year-old waitress at a barbecue joint, and I was a 23-year-old truck driver delivering parts across 5 counties and 2 states. At least I was paying my own bills. June was able to make her car payment while still living at home. I asked her out, but she turned me down because she was going steady with some guy in Asheville. What she didn't realize was she was just a casual fling for him, and nothing more. By the time I returned to the BBQ joint on another trip, they had broken up. This time when I asked her out, she said yes. We had a great time snacking on burgers and taking 6 cans of beer with us. We went to fiddler concerts in Maggie Valley and had a great time. We liked it so much that we repeated it a couple more times. On our 3rd date, I got an idea of the love talents of the future June Sutton. I almost proposed to her at the moment when we were close. That's how good it was. Anyway, a couple of months later, I asked this question, and we got married 3 months later in an open ceremony next to the Old Village Church in Sunburst, North Carolina. A year later, we managed to save enough money to make the down payment on a small white frame house on a couple of acres south of the city. There was nothing special in it, but there was enough space for a garden and a barn that I could use as a workshop. At that time, there was no question of children, and June enrolled in a local college, continuing to work at a barbecue bar after lunch and a couple of evenings a week. I was mostly traveling, delivering goods and taking orders, sometimes traveling overnight to Tennessee. Life continued in the same vein for the next 2 years, until June graduated and got a job as a shift nurse at the local county hospital. I still traveled daily, and I was promoted to the position of regional manager. It didn't distract me much from my work, but the job paid better thanks to the commission share of all sales. With both of us working full-time now and June's shift work, We had to make the most of our time together during the week. She usually had to work every other weekend and rotated to night shifts every 12 weeks, with each shift lasting 12 hours. The only good thing about it was the pay increase. After a couple of years, she was earning almost as much as I was, and we were able to double up on our house payments. On the weekends, when her shifts allowed, we would go to a few night spots in Asheville, usually with 2 or 3 other couples we knew. Some people from her workplace also started to join us, and eventually, we had a regular weekend party group of about 12 people. One of the places we often enjoyed was a dance hall on Patton Road in Asheville. It was a laid-back place with a good mix of people, and we all fit in quite well. We all went as couples, most of us married, and before the night was over, I'd end up dancing with some of the other women, and June did the same with the men. I always thought it was harmless. Occasionally, folks would dance with people they knew from there or from school. I did it too, and so did June. As I said, there was no harm. We all went home with who we arrived with. Yet, as with anything, eventually, some troublemaker comes along and ruins everything. A few months after we started going to that particular place, I was dancing with one of the girls at our table, a co-worker of June's named Terry, who somehow kept steering us towards the other side of the dance floor. I didn't think anything of it because I was, well, innocent. When the next song started playing, she took me to the dance floor for a slow dance and turned up the speed. We were at the far end of the room, away from our table, when she put her hand on my trousers, wrapped her arms around me, and squeezed me gently. "My God, what are you doing?" "Nothing that you don't already want based on what it looks like." I was a young guy dancing with a girl, an amazing girl. Naturally, I was bleeding, and I'm sure that was her intention. But I was happily married, and, despite the many opportunities, I never lost my way and was not going to start. "Terry, I'm a man who loves one woman. If it wasn't, I'm sure you'd turn my world upside down, but tonight it's June's job." I smiled as I said it, trying not to disappoint her. She smiled back and said, "Oh, someday I'll have a chance." Then we changed the subject and finished the dance before I returned it to the escort, a guy named Tom. June and a few others were still on the dance floor. As I was looking around the room, I noticed her dancing right next to a guy I'd never seen before. He whispered something in her ear, making her smile and giggle, and then his hand dropped lower. For a moment I thought about intervening, but then I remembered what Terry had been doing just a few minutes ago. Looking back, I realized that I should have intervened, but now it's all gone. Somebody ordered another round of drinks, and June returned to the table accompanied by her newfound dance partner. I pretended not to know him initially as she introduced him as Charlie, an old high school friend before his family relocated to Asheville. I took an instant disliking to him, perhaps influenced by where his hand had been earlier. Maybe it was the smug grin he wore when he glanced at me with his hand on my wife's shoulder. But June noticed my reaction and cooled down a bit, prompting him to withdraw his hand. He lingered for a few minutes before moving on, giving June a quick kiss on the cheek and shaking my hand. I felt an urge to confront him, but I kept my composure. On the way back to the house, the conversation, as expected, turned violent. "Did you let every guy grope you while you were dancing, June?" "No more than some girl who touched your pants," she retorted. It took me by surprise. Terry stealthily took us to the other side of the room when she started groping me. At that moment, I didn't notice where June was. "I wasn't the initiator, and I stopped it right away," I replied. "Well, me too, big boy. Are you going to be jealous every time some guy thinks he has a chance with me?" She grinned, relieving the tension. "Charlie has as much chance of getting into my pants as Terry had with you tonight. That is, 0. She was right. We both scored and realized that it was time to end the game. We agreed on this later in the evening at home, and after a good warm-up, I hit a home run. Over the next few months, everything went smoothly. We regularly got together, taking turns getting behind the wheel. One Saturday night was particularly memorable. I was driving, and there were more women in our group than men, because 4 guys served in the National Guard. June and a couple of other girls were sipping tequila, clearly intending to get drunk. June had a reputation for drinking tequila, losing all self-control and becoming quite flirtatious. I tried to keep up with her on the dance floor, but other single girls, including June's friend Terry, also struggled for attention. I was busy looking after June and rejecting Terry's advances. "Don't worry about June, Josh. She's outside with the other girls," Terry whispered in my ear. After dancing, I headed back to the patio where the smokers were gathering. June and her friends were having fun, so I left them alone and went back to the table. Terry and another girl from their job were there, both heavily intoxicated. The other girl was so drunk she could barely speak. "So, Josh, June told us that you have a pretty big instrument," the drunk girl slurred. I could only burst out laughing. She was slurring her words, and Terry was just grinning stupidly. Then, by chance, she said something that quickly sobered everyone up. I was the only sober person at the table. Drunk people find everything funny and never know when to shut up. "It's not fair that she has 2 well-heeled guys and we don't have any." They both found it incredibly funny and giggled like schoolgirls until Terry realized the seriousness of what was being said. I understood the meaning of her words as they fell from her lips. I ignored Terry. "And which other well-off guy are you talking about?" I asked. "Charlie. Not only is he well off, but he also shows himself great in bed." "Oh. Shouldn't I have said that?" She mumbled, barely able to speak after Terry shot her a stern look. I think Terry, even when she was drunk, realized the seriousness of the conversation at the table. I got up to go to the men's room and Terry tried to intervene. "Not now, Terry," I said firmly. These comments may have had a different meaning than I assumed, and I didn't know about it. 2 drunken women were laughing at the fact that my wife had 2 lovers, me and someone named Charlie. It could mean that she had a relationship with him before we started dating, or maybe she dated him while we were together, or it could even mean that she's dating him now. Of course, it could just be a meaningless conversation caused by heavy intoxication. Closing time was approaching, and I needed to gather a tipsy group, including several impatient young people who were staring at them, on the patio. The 2 of us, sober drivers, put everyone in 2 cars and hit the road. When June and I got home, it was already 2 a.m., and I had to drag her to bed like a sack. I opened a beer and sat outside contemplating my next move. If she had a one-time slip-up, maybe I could forgive her. But if she was regularly cheating on me with some loser, then it was over. The ironic part is, I know she loves me. That's why I might be able to forgive a one-time mistake, like if she was drunk or something and it didn't happen again. But if it was the same guy as before, then it wasn't a mistake. It was a choice. I had been working night shifts on Tuesdays and Wednesdays for a while now. June had Tuesdays off on her current schedule, so if she was seeing someone on the side, those Tuesdays were her best bet to keep it discreet. Funny how fate sometimes lines up perfectly. That's how it played out with my marriage. Instead of staying over in Sevierville, TN, that Tuesday night, I drove back to Waynesville. I picked up some BBQ and drinks, then settled in to watch from the upper field across from our place. It was 11 p.m. when I got there, and June's car was nowhere to be seen. I had called her earlier that evening, as I usually do, letting her know I'd be back late the next afternoon. She had plans to stay in, watch TV, and maybe call her sister before bedtime. If she did call, it seems she used a payphone. So I just sat there in the truck, relaxed with the window down, listening to a ball game on the radio with the interior lights turned off. Around 12:30, 2 sets of headlights approached from the Waynesville direction and slowed down as they turned into the yard. June's car was in its usual spot, and the other car parked right behind it. I didn't need to guess who it was. It was Charlie himself, my rival from the dance floor. The audacious guy even had the nerve to wear a cowboy hat. Their actions were very intimate when they sneaked into my house in the early morning. The usual procedure followed. The light came on in the bedroom, casting a soft glow from the bedside lamps. I was tempted to contradict them, but the moment was not right. I sat there fuming at her, at the whole world, thinking cruel thoughts that could lead to tragic consequences. But the prospect of jail, even just the local county jail, held me back. I stayed in place until about 2 a.m., when the lights came on again. Soon after, her lover came out of the front door, exchanged a kiss with her, and walked confidently back to his car, while June ordered him to be silent. As I mentioned, if I were the killer, Charlie would already be lying 6 feet deep. Instead, I started my truck, turned off the headlights, and drove back to Waynesville in silence. This pattern was repeated over the next 2 weeks, leading to the same results. The following week, I decided it was time to put an end to it. This time, they returned home a little earlier. As soon as the light came on in the bedroom, I crossed the street, went to his car, and flattened all 4 tires, including one of June's tires. I didn't want any unnecessary expenses to be deducted from the account. When I got to the back of the house, the night lights were already on, and the bedroom window was open to let in cool air. The picture, with the evidence of her infidelity, was taken perfectly. Entering through the back door, I recorded a video on my phone and slowly approached the bedroom. By that time, they were already fully engaged in the process and did not pay attention to anything. I filmed it all on video. I turned on the light, and the look of surprise on their faces was priceless. "This seems like a completely impossible situation," I remarked to them. It was incredibly awkward. Charlie stumbled, desperately trying to cover himself with something. I pointed to his clothes. June was shocked to be caught and cried uncontrollably. I checked the S&W on my belt and ordered him to get out immediately. He hurriedly gathered up his clothes and rushed past me, confident that he was fleeing. The door slammed behind him, and I turned to June just as he screamed, "Jesus Christ, my car!" He found flat tires. Wherever he went next, he did not return inside. "Josh, please let me explain. I know that there is a book of excuses for every person in a similar situation, but when they reach the last page, the message becomes crystal clear. No way in the world. June, shut up and listen to me. Just tell me one thing. How many times have you cheated on me with him?" "Josh, please listen to me," she begged. "Just once, I swear," she cried again. "Thank God for that," I muttered, leaving the bedroom and heading to the kitchen for a cold beer. The land shark sank smoothly, while I watched her wrap herself in her old pink robe. I drank 1 bottle, opened another, and went outside. Peckerwood was nowhere to be seen, and moonlight reflected off the hood of his car with 4 flat tires. I chuckled to myself, proud of my resilience. A couple of weeks ago, I was already shedding tears. Now it was a matter of holding myself together and doing business. Just once, damn it. I drove my truck out of the field on the other side of the road and parked it behind the house, considering my next move. In the barn, I had a sturdy hitch for pulling loads, so I chained the guy's car to it and started my journey into Waynesville, which was about 5 miles away. About 1.5 miles down the road, I passed him with his car dragging behind me, all 4 tires flat and worn down to the rims. When I reached Waynesville near the Salvation Army store, I left his car in a parking lot and headed back home. June was sitting at the kitchen table when I walked in. "Joshua, can we talk about this, please?" she asked. I glanced at her and simply said, "Not tonight," grabbing the rest of the 6-pack before retreating to my shop out back. It was my mechanic's man cave, where I had set up a decent retreat space in the loft. With Mars Hotel playing softly in the background, I finished the remaining beers and drifted off to sleep. The following day, I called my boss and explained that I had some personal matters to attend to at home. I went inside to confront June. "June, you need to move out and stay with your sister. You're the one who messed up." Surprisingly, she didn't argue. Maybe she thought reassuring me it was a one-time mistake would make things easier. Her sister came over, and after fixing a flat tire, they loaded her belongings into their cars. Before they left, Anne, her sister, came to talk with me. I always liked Anne and harbored no ill will towards her as family. Josh, are you going to take her back? Did you know she was cheating on me? Anne shook her head, wiping away a tear. You two have always been so good together. It breaks my heart to see this happening. Me too, Anne, me too. I hugged her, and they drove off down the road. The day after I submitted the separation papers, chaos ensued. It began with June, then involved her parents, friends, my own parents, siblings, and so on. Everyone believed we could resolve our issues and everything would be fine, chalking it up to a one-time mistake. June. Tell everyone the truth or I'll distribute the video and photos from our previous hookups to everyone you know. I think she was shocked when she realized I knew about our past encounters. Nevertheless, she must have said something because the explanations changed. Now it was excuses like, young people make mistakes all the time, and that we were young and could figure it out, maybe even have a couple of babies. It was relentless, incessant. Eventually, I stopped answering calls unless they were work-related. I instructed June to come to the house while I was at work to collect anything else she wanted. I was in the process of filing to retain the house and buy out her share. There wouldn't be any spousal support as everything we owned went into the house except for some retirement savings we each had from work. It was quite straightforward. The divorce was finalized 6 months later, despite ongoing attempts and pleas from June to reconcile. She would confront me in restaurants, joining me wherever I sat. Her sister Anne visited frequently to chat and bring me food, though I initially wondered if she had romantic intentions herself, which she didn't. Eventually, I decided to take a unique approach to stop the unwanted attention. I called Terry and invited her to a dance hall on Patton Street one Friday night. She accepted, and she ended up spending the entire weekend at my house and in my bed. I had underestimated her. She completely exhausted me and left me with a grin on my face for a whole week. Choosing Terry wasn't just about knowing she would be passionate. I also knew she couldn't keep anything confidential. I was certain she was recounting every detail of our time together to impress her colleagues at work, including June, who was still in her social circle. The plan worked, even better than I had anticipated. The following weekend arrived, and on that Friday night, I went alone to the dance hall. June seemed to have switched to day shifts because she was there with a few of her old friends, and to my surprise, Charlie was with them. I've never quite grasped how women think at times. I suppose it's one of those challenges men face. June, her sister, her parents, and practically everyone else I could think of except for a few women with different agendas were all scheming to persuade me to take her back. Yet, there she was with Charlie. I took a seat at the bar, nursing a cold beer while observing the couples on the dance floor. It didn't take long before June and Charlie gracefully took to the floor, performing a provocative dance that seemed directed at someone. I presumed it was aimed at me. After their dance, Charlie swaggered back to the table and June approached the bar. It doesn't have to be like this, Josh. Like what? Us not being together and seeing other people. I'm here on my own, I replied, scanning the room ostentatiously. June began to wheeze. From the very beginning of our marriage, I knew that this meant trouble was brewing, so I intervened. Leaning closer, I whispered in her ear. Listen carefully, June. I don't care if this guy was close to you in every conceivable way. You've been with him for a while, so you can keep enjoying it. Just so you know, I had a great time with your friend Terry last weekend, and honestly, it was fantastic. I might even do it again. Her reaction was lightning fast. She slapped me hard in the face and then burst into tears. Peckerwood made a move to leave the table, but changed his mind when I motioned for him to stay. Do you see that guy you're with? He froze when I signaled him to stop. All he cares about is your body. It's always been that way, and you've given him what belonged to me over and over again. You ruined something special between us, and let that asshole into our bed, into our lives. So now you have to put up with it. I moved on. I finished my beer in one go and left. She chased after me in tears, but I just started my truck and drove off. I ended up at Jack of the Wood, sipping on a Green Man ale and watching hippie chicks dance. Later, I found out June left with a friend shortly after I did. Rumor had it she wasn't going out as much anymore. Despite my temptation, I didn't reconnect with Therese like I told June I might. She was too good to forget. Instead, I threw myself into work. June and Anne still tried to reach out to me when they could, though Anne seemed to realize it was futile. Our families were another story. My parents kept inviting June over for BBQs even when I wasn't there. They saw her as the daughter they never had and weren't ready to let her go. I think we all made some changes in our lives due to the divorce and its aftermath. Personally, I found myself gravitating back towards nature. Growing up in and around the Smoky Mountains and national forests gave me a deep sense of belonging and identity. I never identified as a hillbilly or a redneck. At heart, I always felt like I was meant for the woods. So I adjusted my travel routines. Instead of my usual routes through Murphy or across I-40 into Tennessee, I started taking the old Cataloochee Turnpike, or the Hooch Road, through the mountains. It added more miles to my journey, but on pleasant days it was a beautiful ride. Sometimes I would even stop to fish in a stream along the way. I don't know how I missed seeing that charming white farmhouse on the Tennessee side during all my earlier trips, but one day I finally noticed it. After finishing mowing the lawn and stowing away the mower, I was just about to crack open a cold beer when my phone buzzed in my pocket. Joshua. Hi. It's Sandra Dresser from Cosby. You dropped by last week to fix your truck. I instantly recalled her. She'd been on my mind these past few days. There was something about her that put me at ease, despite us only having met briefly. I'd been meaning to call her about the '57 Ford with some new information. Hello, Ms. Sandra. I never forget a gracious hostess. I was planning to reach out in a day or two about that old Ford of yours. Yes, that's actually why I'm calling. That and the others out there. You got me thinking about them again, and I've decided to take action. I thought maybe you'd like to swing by next time you're passing through and help me figure out my next steps. There were 11 old vehicles out there, all in remarkably good shape from what I'd seen. Figuring out the next steps was straightforward. Assess and sell them. She knew that already, so the invitation was personal. I'll be passing through next Thursday, but truth be told, I wouldn't mind taking a drive through the mountains tomorrow since it's supposed to be a beautiful Sunday, I suggested optimistically. 30 minutes later, I found myself in a barber's chair in Waynesville, getting a trim, having picked up a good Cabernet on the way home. I usually stick to beer, but I can appreciate a good red wine when I find one. The next morning at 9 o'clock, I set out on my usual route on a beautiful day. As I approached Big Creek, I noticed fishermen on both sides of the bridge. If I hadn't had plans further down the road, I would have stopped longer. Just as I arrived, a young kid was reeling in a nice 1LB, trout he had caught with what looked like a mayfly imitation. After a quick stop, I continued down the road. Upon pulling into Miss Sandra's gravel driveway, I saw her engaged in an animated conversation with a man, while her two dogs sat attentively nearby. Another man sat in a parked vehicle, observing the scene. I parked my truck and started walking towards them. The conversation seemed to be escalating as I approached. Now, Bill told me I could have that 65 back there in exchange for some work I did for him a couple months ago, damn it, the man said to Sandra. Well, I don't know anything about it. As far as I'm concerned, Bill finished everything out here over 2 years ago. If he owes you something, you'll have to sort it out with him, not me, Sandra replied firmly. Hold on just a minute, he began to retort before I interrupted. Morning, Ms. Sandra. Is everything all right here? She looked slightly apprehensive before answering. Everything's fine, Joshua. This gentleman was just leaving. The man glared at me with fury in his eyes, but I responded with a smile and wished him a good day. As he drove off in his truck towards Cosby, I turned to her and asked, "What was that all about?" "I think my ex-husband is causing trouble," she sighed. "He's not supposed to be here. He can't even drive down this road due to a restraining order." I chuckled to myself and added, "Well, that's convenient. Oh, by the way, I brought a bottle of wine, a 12 St. Francis Cabernet. Should we put it in the fridge for a bit?" She smiled warmly, and we walked back up to the porch with the dogs following. After stowing the wine away, we settled on the porch and discussed the collection of vintage cars in the barn. Among them were a 57 Ford, a 65 Fairlane, a 67 Barracuda, a 69 Olds 442, and a 48 Caddy, along with several other nondescript sedans. It was a substantial nest egg if she decided to sell them at fair market value. "I know someone who'd be interested in that 57, I mentioned. "Given its current condition, I think you could fetch at least $8,000, maybe $10,000. "Tell them I'm interested," she replied with a hint of excitement. We continued our conversation about the remaining stock, and I agreed to reach out to a contact in Sevilleville who has experience dealing with these items. I hoped he could sell them on commission to ensure a fair price. With that settled, I enjoyed a delicious meal of fried chicken and all the trimmings. After cleaning up, we strolled through the pasture and into the wooded mountains behind her property. The scenery here is stunning, a blend of farmland and lush green mountains, as beautiful as anywhere on earth. Eventually, we reached a clearing beside a babbling brook and paused to take it all in. "So, Josh, what's your story? Married, single, seeing someone, divorced? Where have you been and where are you headed?" I didn't quite know what to say, so I opted for honesty, albeit a censored version. I shared about discovering June's affair, which effectively ended our marriage. I described the challenges with her and her sister, both sets of parents, and all our friends pushing me to reconcile. I even mentioned dating Terry to provoke a reaction from June and to show I was moving forward. I admitted that I do go out occasionally, but nothing serious has developed. Sandra smiled through the story as if she had been through something similar herself, which, as it turned out, she had in a way. "Josh, all right, I'll share mine now. I got married right after high school. Biggest mistake of my life. If I had known back then that life would be good for a few years and then suddenly turn awful overnight, I would have hopped on the first bus out of that place. We did have some good years before it all fell apart, much like your experiences, I suppose, although my peckerwood was completely diluted." She burst out laughing. "Calling him that is probably the funniest thing. Bill Dresser, ever heard of him? He's from down south near Hazelwood, up in Balsam, not far from where you are." I shook my head. "Well, it seems he took a liking, as my dad used to say, to a girl over in Cosby who wasn't as interested as he thought. I guess they had a thing a couple of times without her knowing he was married, and when she found out I was his wife, she dropped him like a hot potato. God, this is hilarious. She drove over here one day while Bill was at work and confessed everything, apologizing profusely to me the whole time. We knew each other from high school but never hung out together. Apparently, Bill couldn't take no for an answer. The girl went to Texas to stay with her father, largely because Bill kept bothering her. Bill drove to Texas to pursue her. She called me to let me know, and that's when I packed up all his belongings and told him to come pick them up before they got rained on. Well, he returned 2 days later, broke into the house while I was away, made a mess, and brought his stuff back inside. When I got home that night with Samson and Delilah, I cornered him with both dogs while I put his stuff back outside on the lawn. "My dogs know who their mama is, don't you, babies?" She affectionately rubbed their fur and collars as they sat obediently at her feet, tongues hanging out, watching me. The next day, my father and I went to the lawyer's office and got a restraining order against him. A few days later, he was served with it at work. The following week, he was back in Texas chasing after that poor girl. I still talk to her occasionally. She's a nice kid, but she's smart enough to tell him to leave her alone. Last I heard, he was living in some woman's trailer over in Silva. If Sandra was still feeling any pain from her experiences, she certainly didn't show it, sporting a huge smile on her face. Getting rid of that jerk was the smartest thing I've ever done, she remarked after a moment of reflection. We continued talking for a while longer, during which I learned that Sandra had done quite well for herself since her divorce. She worked as a nurse practitioner specializing in midwifery across much of eastern Tennessee, mainly in the foothills. She had inherited her grandmother's farm a few years back and, until the divorce, had been managing a small 3-acre tobacco plot. With her frequent travel, there was no one to tend it. Later, when we returned to the house, I took some pictures of the old cars near the barn to show my friend. Since it was getting late in the afternoon and I had work the next day, we decided to call it a day and exchanged a warm hug, which she extended with a lingering kiss on my cheek. I might drop by one evening this week, maybe Thursday, if I hear back from my friend in Sevierville. I'd really like that, Mr. Josh Sutton. If I'm not out on a call, I'll give you a call to confirm, she smiled. I returned to Hooch Road that late Sunday afternoon, feeling like a kid caught up in his first schoolyard crush. It had been somewhat of a half-date, not officially a date, but there was definitely something more than just a casual social visit. I couldn't wait for Thursday to arrive. On Tuesday evenings, the BBQ joint offered all-you-can-eat fried catfish with all the trimmings for $9.99, plus drinks. Picture thin strips of fried fish, coleslaw, beans, potato salad, and the best Carolina hush puppies in the state. June and I used to go there together, but this particular evening, I walked in alone and settled into a booth with a newspaper to read while I ate. I hadn't even started eating when they walked in, spotted me, and all three slid into my booth. Well, look who's here. The long-lost traveler, Dad said as he squeezed in next to me in the booth. Mom and June took the seats opposite me. I'd be lying if I said June didn't look stunning. She looked more than stunning, and she knew I noticed. I suppose you all just happened to be here while I'm sitting like this, I asked, addressing no one in particular. We come every Tuesday, Josh. You know that, Mom replied. June simply smiled, her eyes sparkling. It enhanced her already charming presence. Yep, Tuesday for catfish and Thursday for brisket, best in the Carolinas, Dad added. Realizing I was outnumbered, I joined them at the serving line and settled down to eat. It seemed like there was a competition to see who could eat the most. I was just trying not to eat the least. It was one of the most awkward meals I'd had in a while, but for them it was like old times. Isn't this wonderful? I remember when all four of us used to come here every week, Mom said, her smile wide. June looked radiant. I excused myself to use the restroom. When I returned, Dad started to get up to let me back in, but I gently stopped him. No need, Dad. I have an early morning tomorrow. I should head out. I'm in Hickory first thing, I said. I left a 20 on the table, wished everyone a great evening with a smile, including June, and left with a satisfied grin. It was only 6:30 p.m. 30 minutes later, I was at Boojum's tap room with a cold pint in front of me. The tap room had always been a favorite haunt, though until recently it lacked live entertainment, unless you counted the occasional inadvertent hillbilly drunk. A couple of months back, Ben and Kelsey, the owners, introduced a live band on Saturday nights and expanded the dance floor. Since June and her friends weren't regulars there, I made it a point to drop by often. It was also a good place to meet a friendly girl with shared interests. That night, Ben was behind the bar pouring my usual double IPA while I surveyed the scene. A couple of girls were playing pool and the usual early evening crowd of guys were sipping pints and watching a game on the screen above the bar. Long time no see, stranger. How've you been? She asked, taking the seat beside me. As always, Terry looked damn good. Perfect for a laid-back evening like this. It had been a while since we last went out, that first time when I had hoped to nudge June toward moving on with her life. Clearly, it hadn't worked out. I'm doing great, Terry. You're looking fantastic yourself, I replied sincerely. I'm hanging in there. Things have been slow, but seeing you here gives me hope, she said, patting my thigh. I bought her a beer and we found a table in the corner near the pool players. We caught up on news and I learned that the old group still got together on weekends occasionally, with June joining in. I didn't ask about her ex, and Terry didn't offer any details. It wasn't my business. But, as I sat there with her, I knew who I wanted to spend the evening with. I made love to her twice that night before we both fell asleep. In the morning, when I returned from the bathroom, she surprised me by dragging me back to bed. She didn't have to rush to work, so she stayed in bed at my place for a while longer. "Josh, I know we're not going to be a couple, but I'd like things to be normal between us, if you don't mind," she said. After the night we spent and waking up in the morning, I thought it was a good idea. That's fine with me, as long as none of us have a serious relationship with someone else. The same day, Sandra called to inform me she would be home Thursday afternoon and evening, unless she was needed for an unexpected delivery. Her call really brightened my day, and I checked in with my friend in Sevierville. When I reviewed his email, I learned Sandra stood to make a substantial amount of money if she accepted his offer. When I returned home that evening, chaos erupted at the Joshua Sutton place. Earlier, I had welcomed Terry into my home for the day. Around lunchtime, June and my mom unexpectedly dropped by, seemingly under some pretext. It wasn't the first time June had done this. She often found reasons to visit, whether I was present or not. This time she came across Terry in his underwear with one of my cropped t-shirts. It was obvious what Terry had intended, especially in my absence. June lost her composure. Clearly she wasn't prepared to find another woman in what used to be her home, and the two of them clashed while my mom attempted to intervene. Aside from a few pulled hairs and smeared makeup, no one was seriously injured. A potted plant got knocked over, but that was the extent of the physical damage. About half an hour after I arrived home, they drove up to the house, Mom, Dad, and June. I'm not sure what they wanted to achieve with this, but I took a sip of beer from the bottle and waited for them to come in. Mom spoke first. "Joshua, I do not know what kind of family you have, but it is unacceptable for strangers to come and go at any time of the day." Dad sat in silence, realizing that it was better not to interfere. I looked at June, then back at Mom. "Well then, Mom, let me ask you this. How old am I?" 30. "And how long have I been living on my own?" "Since you turned 19, I guess." "That's right, since I turned 19, and I've been living in this house since I was 24, right?" She nodded. "So, Mom, am I a married man?" "Well, you were, and you should be." I interrupted her abruptly. "Yes, I was like that. But now I'm not like that. Do you see how it works? Now another question. Who are these strangers you're talking about, Mom? Because as far as I know, there was only one person who ever showed disrespect to this house, who cheated on her husband in the bedroom. So who are these strangers walking around my house? I'd like to know." Both Mom and June sat there on the couch, stunned and unable to respond. Dad began to mutter something about not speaking to Mom that way, but he stopped short before he dug himself deeper into trouble. So I took over. "Let's be clear here. I pretty much run this place. As a 30-year-old adult who's not married and definitely not a monk, I enjoy having some company around now and then." "You could have me," June blurted out tearfully. I chuckled and took another sip. "I did have you, and we know how that turned out. Anyway, here's the deal. I don't want anyone popping into my house during the day when I'm not here. I've let it slide before, but now I'm laying down the law. If I can't trust you, I'm changing the locks. And just as important, if I've got company you don't approve of, don't drop by. Come another time and we can grill some burgers. But if there's a lovely lady hanging out in my bachelor pad, imagine how it looks when Mom and Dad come barging in, eh?" I grinned at the three of them. "So does anyone want a beer or something to drink? June, that includes you." Mom and Dad fetched drinks and grabbed some leftover chicken from the fridge. I took June out to my workshop. "Look, I'm setting clear boundaries here. You have no right to come into my house and criticize the people I spend time with or anything else in my life, June. By no means. I know you're seeing someone right now. I've never understood why you think it's acceptable for someone to be close to you. But you get upset when others like Susie Q, Jill from up the hill, and even Terry find love after you gave up everything for Charlie. You made that decision, June, not me. I have no idea who you're dating right now, and to be honest, I don't care. Here's the thing. You need to start behaving in a civilized way. Live your life and stop trying to interfere in my relationship with my parents. I understand that they care about you and you care about them. I understood. But leave Terry alone. She didn't do anything to you, and neither did I, for that matter. She looked down at the ground, and when she looked up, I saw the pain in her eyes. I knew she still loved me. But despite that, she couldn't stay away from this guy, even when she was supposedly trying to make peace with me. We returned to the house where Mom and Dad relaxed and watched an old TV show. By the time everyone left, I was completely exhausted, apart from having to call Terry. I had to apologize to her for the family drama. The next day, Anne, June's sister, joined me at lunch at a local diner. "Hi, Josh, you look great as always." I've always had a soft spot for Anne and appreciated her warmth. I was talking to June this morning, and she mentioned yesterday's episode, as she called it. I think she's starting to understand, Josh. It's hard to see things end like this, and you know how I feel. To be honest, if you weren't my brother-in-law and always will be, I would have approached you myself. Now I'm going to try to put her on a different path and see what happens. But it seems like everything you said to her resonated, because she told me she was going to try to move forward. That's good news, Anne. I'm grateful to you for being with her. I've always loved her, but I couldn't accept what she did. Yes, she knows that. She was fixated on this worthless man she was dating even before you met. But I think she understands now that he cost her everything. I just nodded, and we continued chatting for a while before she had to go back to work. I paid the bill and then went to the mountains to make a trip to Tennessee. When I arrived at Sandra's that Thursday, she was busy in her garden, and her dogs, as usual, happily announced my arrival. It was unbearably hot, and Sandra was dressed accordingly, very short cropped jeans and a tight V-neck t-shirt, nothing else. I tried my best not to stare at her. She hugged me before we went inside to make ourselves some refreshments. "My kids seem to like you," she remarked, pointing to the panting dog sprawled on the kitchen floor. "I'd rather they told me about it themselves," I joked. She made herself an iced tea and handed me a cold beer. A short while later, we delved into the details of selling her collection of cars. My friend in Sevierville proposed auctioning them with an 8% commission and a guaranteed minimum of $65,000 for the lot. Considering their condition, I thought it was a fair deal, and Sandra agreed to move forward. With that settled, we relaxed on the porch, savoring our drinks in the late afternoon heat. "Feel like swimming?" she asked, a playful grin on her face. "Daddy widened and deepened it a couple years back, so it's a nice hole, especially today." "I didn't bring any swim trunks." "No need, there's no one around." Well, I'm not shy around women, and I know I'm in decent shape, so I agreed, trying to suppress a broad grin. We grabbed a couple more beers and towels and headed towards the rear of the property. When we reached the spot, Sandra simply stripped off her shorts and top, tossed them onto a branch, and leapt into the pond fed by the creek. I'm not going to lie. I hesitated for a moment, but then I shrugged and started taking off my outerwear. When I turned out to be the same as Sandra, I dived into the pond. The water came up to my shoulders. Sandra was standing next to me with a big smile on her face. "I used to come here as a little girl when my grandmother lived here. On hot days like this, we both jumped into the water and swam. Great memories. There used to be a couple of boys down the road who spied on us girls until Grandma put her dog to guard this place. As a child, my favorite thing was to swim in the ice hole, when the two of us got to Jonathan Creek and jumped into the water. But the water was cold." I laughed at the memory of it. I dived under the water and swam for a while before surfacing next to Sandra. When I surfaced, our faces were only inches apart, and I looked straight into her blue eyes. The next moment, her arms were wrapped around my neck. "I like you, Josh Sutton. I really like you." With that, she kissed me. My hands went to her waist, but I did nothing but pull her to me in the water. When we broke off the kiss, she looked at me, and I told her, "Miss Sandra, I've been in love with you like a schoolboy since the first time we met." "Okay, you can take me out to dinner tonight instead of having dinner at home." After that, we swam a little longer before pulling ourselves out of the pond. After drying off and strolling back to the house, we ventured into Cosby Town. It's worth noting that Cosby doesn't offer many choices for fine dining, but there's the Magnolia Tree, known for its excellent brisket, so that's where we went. They seated us at a cozy table, and I had one of the most enjoyable dining experiences in a long while, largely thanks to the wonderful company of the woman I was with. We covered just about every topic imaginable over dinner, and by the time we left, darkness was setting in. I still needed to get her home, so we arrived back at her place around 9:30. Walking her to the door, I kissed her goodbye, with Samson and Delilah watching attentively. "You don't need to drive back to Sevierville tonight, Josh. I have a guest room ready for you. Enjoy a good breakfast and leave as early as you like." Her warm invitation convinced me, and after canceling my hotel reservation for the evening, I spent the night in her guest room, not her bed. She sent me off the next morning with a hearty country breakfast. This time we made plans for Saturday afternoon and dinner in Gatlinburg. That Saturday night, we stayed overnight at a bed and breakfast in the village of Gatlinburg, where Sandra and I made love until early morning. Sandra was unlike any woman I'd ever dated before, especially compared to June, and of course Terry. Since then, we started taking each other more seriously. We started spending more time together. I often stayed with her, and Sandra sometimes came to Waynesville. I had the opportunity to meet her father, who was initially wary of me until Sandra talked to him alone. No matter what she said, it worked, because after that, he became friendly and welcoming to me. One bright and sunny Saturday morning, as I was catching a dry fly over the ripples of Big Creek, I made an important decision to take the next important step in my life. As soon as this idea took shape in my head, my rod jerked sharply and the reel spun while the fish was struggling with the line. After an exciting struggle, I caught a decent 1.5-kilogram trout. It seemed like a good omen, and confirmed that life was moving in a promising direction. Later that afternoon, Sandra and I drove back to Waynesville and decided to spend the evening in Asheville. We ended up at the dance hall on Patton Avenue, where I used to frequent with my old group of friends. Since becoming serious with Sandra, I hadn't spent much time with them, including Terry, and our relationship had been put on hold. As expected, I ran into many familiar faces. Terry was there with her current companion of the night, along with several others from our old gang, including some colleagues from the hospital where Terry and June still worked. Across the room, I spotted June. She was with a guy I didn't recognize, and she appeared content. June had evidently moved forward in life, and she had even apologized to me for the end of our marriage. My parents still treated her like a daughter, which didn't bother me anymore. Of course, she was unaware of my serious relationship with Sandra, and this would be the first time she would see us together. Sandra and I danced a few songs and were chatting at the bar when June approached from behind me. "Hello there," she greeted me as I turned around. "Well, hello, June. You're looking great," I replied, scanning the area but not seeing her date. "Thanks, Josh. Your parents mentioned you've been doing well and spending a lot of time working in Tennessee. I'm genuinely happy for you." I introduced her to Sandra, noticing a hint of sadness in June's eyes, though she concealed it well from everyone, or so I thought. After a brief hug, she returned to her group. Suddenly, I felt a glancing blow to the side of my head. Sandra screamed, "No, Bill, you can't do this." Before I could react, he swung at me again, and I responded with a powerful right hook that knocked him down. Sandra was in tears, and unexpectedly, June rushed over to help the man on the floor. "What the hell, Josh?" June exclaimed. Confused, I looked at her, trying to piece together the situation, realizing this was the man she had been with earlier. "He's my ex-husband, Bill," Sandra whispered to me. "June, he attacked Josh, not the other way around. Sandra explained. The bouncers arrived, lifting Bill off the ground and escorting him out as June excused herself to the restroom. Sandra and I returned to the bar, finding 2 fresh drinks waiting for us. Now you understand why I had a restraining order. He's unstable, Sandra said. I agreed reluctantly and tried to push it out of my mind. The incident had soured the evening, and as we contemplated leaving, June approached us again. Sandra explained his identity and profession, leaving June nearly in tears. Since he had been her ride, whether by an incredible coincidence or not, she was now stranded. So Sandra and I decided to drive her home to her sister Anne's place. As we made our way out, June paused to wave goodbye to someone. Sandra and I headed toward the parking lot, with June catching up behind us. Just as I noticed a sudden flash of white and a loud pop ahead, I fell to the ground, drew my concealed weapon, and immediately fired 2 shots at Bill Dresser, hitting him squarely in the chest and bringing him down instantly. I quickly checked myself for injuries but felt no pain or impact, indicating the drunkard had missed me. Suddenly, Sandra screamed in panic. "Oh my God, she's been shot." I turned and saw June lying on her back, a trickle of blood coming from a small hole in her right temple. Security personnel rushed over as I reached her side, finding her still alive but semi-conscious. Some describe the sensation as time freezing, but for me, it was like observing a scene from a movie, slightly detached. A woman asked me to step aside so she could administer first aid. Within what felt like moments, but was actually a few minutes, an EMT arrived and took over. They transported her to Mission Hospital, and we followed. At some point, I managed to call Anne, informing her of the situation and asking her to come to the hospital. When I arrived, June had already gone into surgery, and we were waiting anxiously in the surgical waiting room for any updates. Finally, a nurse emerged and informed us that June was still in surgery, and that it would be a long night before they could assess her condition definitively. At present, she was in critical condition. Sandra and Anne stayed close together while I went to find something to eat. When I returned, I found them standing arm in arm near a window. Anne was visibly shaken, but after we managed to get some food into her, we all found seats nearby and settled in to wait out the surgery. It was 3 hours later when a doctor came out with an update. "We've moved her to intensive care and we believe she's going to survive," the doctor began. "The full extent of the damage won't be clear until she wakes from the induced coma we placed her in to aid her recovery." The bullet fragmented upon impact, with one fragment affecting her medial temporal lobe, which could potentially impact certain types of memory. However, we won't have clarity on this until later. Based on our findings during surgery, her motor functions appear unaffected. We'll have a clearer picture in the coming days. We were given permission to quietly visit with her for a few minutes, and Sandra and I spent the evening consoling my upset sister-in-law. The next morning, the doctors updated Anne and her parents. It was essentially the same as the previous night. June remained in the induced coma for 4 days. When she was finally awakened, Anne and her parents were present, and the first person she requested to see was me. Before I went to the hospital to visit her, Anne briefed me. She can speak and hear well, though her right eye is still a bit blurry. The doctors believe it will improve with time. The concerning part is her memory loss. She doesn't remember how or where she was shot or by whom. And here's the tough part, Josh. She still thinks she's married to you. It's as if the last 2 or 3 years never happened. She thinks you two were planning to start a family soon, but that will have to wait a couple of months or so. I was at a loss for words and debated whether I should even go to the hospital, but Sandra insisted I go. She accompanied me, but stayed downstairs in the lobby while I went up to the ward. June looked disheveled, but was awake and resting. Her parents had just gone downstairs, and Anne was seated on the other side of her. She didn't waste any time. "Josh, where are my wedding rings? I remember having them yesterday morning, or whenever it was before all of this happened." Anne looked at me sadly, almost as if she expected me to respond as though I were still her husband. I was at a loss for what to do. The issue was that I was in love, with the engagement ring still sitting in my bedroom dresser, waiting for an opportunity I thought would have come days ago. "June, do you know what the date is or what year it is?" I asked gently. "Well, it's supposed to be July 2012, but my doctor says otherwise, and I just don't understand," she replied. Glancing at Anne, I inquired, "You haven't told her?" She shook her head, a tear forming in her eye. "June, don't worry about your rings right now. It's more important that you focus on getting well and hopefully recovering some of your memory," I said, trying to smile but feeling troubled inside. June wanted to hold my hand, and I didn't object, even though my mind was racing trying to process everything. We talked about many things, family, her recovery, but I avoided discussing the difficult truths looming over us. Later in the waiting area, I spoke with both Anne and June's doctor about her memory outlook. It appeared she was fine with most memories, recognizing family and friends, but struggled with connecting dates and events. There were many things she couldn't recall, including her affair and our divorce. "Is there a chance she'll regain these memories?" I asked the doctor. "It's difficult to say. Sometimes triggers like a person or a place can spark recognition. We'll have to wait and see. I can't advise you on what to do next, Mr. Sutton. All I can say is it's uncertain. She might stay as she is, or she might recover everything. We just don't know." I thanked the doctor and hugged Anne tightly. I also confessed that I had intended to propose to Sandra the night June was shot, but hadn't had the chance. Anne informed me that Sandra had already told her about it. It seemed my secret wasn't as well kept as I had thought. The truth was, I already knew what I needed to do. I just had to go downstairs and do it. The two Can-Am Spyder F3s sped along the gravel path of the old Hooch Road, wind whipping through our hair and leaving a mile of dust in our wake. Upon reaching the Big Creek Bridge, we pulled into the rest area to take a break and try our luck at catching that elusive brown trout. As it turns out, he still swims those waters today. Much has changed since June was shot and Bill Dresser was laid to rest after our incident in Asheville last year. I sold my house in Waynesville and transitioned to working out of a regional office in Cosby, a choice afforded to me by the company. Opting to stay in an extra room at Sandra's farmhouse made sense given my frequent daytime travels. While I still have occasional overnight assignments, they are manageable. Sandra has expanded her role as a nurse practitioner midwife into nearly full-time work. Last May, we took a blissful 2-week break together in Key West to soak up the sun. Joshua and Sandra Sutton returned, half-rested, bronzed, and ready to embark on their new journey together. A year ago, as I descended in the elevator to meet Sandra in the hospital lobby, my thoughts drifted to my failed marriage and the potential future ahead of me. The decision was clear-cut. I had already moved on. Why should I sacrifice the happiness I now enjoyed for someone who remained unfaithful, even if she didn't recall any of it? I've seen drinkers and addicts who don't remember their actions yet are still accountable for them. Anne facilitated matters. She sat June down and confronted her with reality. She even brought Charlie, my old adversary, hoping it might jog June's memory, but to no avail. Ultimately, June accepted the truth, despite her lack of memory, and I believe that realization brought her considerable remorse. She went through a phase of depression, and then something extraordinary happened. Sandra independently traveled to Waynesville one afternoon while I was away overnight, unbeknownst to me. She recounted the incident to me a couple of months later. "Josh, I felt compelled to take action. Consider how you'd feel if the same thing happened to you. Imagine the woman you love suddenly runs off without explanation to marry someone else. I can't say for certain how I'd react, but I imagine it would be similar to what June is going through. She knew her husband, or the man who used to be her husband, was in love with another woman and planned to marry her. That must have been devastating for her, and I empathize with that. She understood the truth, and it was facing her actions that plunged her into such deep depression. I presented her with a choice: to either dwell in self-pity and misery for what she had done, or to move forward with her life, much like she did after the shooting. She chose to move on, and one of the benefits of that was her friendship with me, with both of us. That's what she's doing now. As we cast our lines into Big Creek, 2 more Can-Am spiders pulled up beside ours. June and her partner of the past 6 months disembarked and joined us in coaxing the big fish to strike once more. Despite the challenges of betrayal, divorce, and moving on to new relationships, June and I somehow emerged as friends. My parents still adore her and frequently invite her and her new partner over. They've accepted reality and cherish Sandra as much as they do June. Life is good now for me, and the biggest concern on my horizon is how to fit our growing family onto a new 2-seater Can-Am. Last night, Sandra shared the news that I'm going to be a father.